And many thanks, Stephen, as well. It's a great pleasure to speak to you this evening, and it's nice that technology makes it possible for me to speak to you from my living room in Dublin and to be virtually in Belfast tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research on Irish women and the Great War, which I've been working on for the past decade, and talk broadly about it, giving you some stories of some of the women who are involved, some of the main themes and issues that affected them. And then I'm going to talk in a bit of detail about the book that I finished, which was published last summer, Irish Women and the Great War. And I'll be talking about it, sort of the process of writing it and some of the sources and so forth that I used. Okay. So when war broke out in August 1914, many women in Ireland felt some relief. They realised it offered a chance to escape civil war on the island of Ireland over the issue of home rule, which of course was looming very large at the time. And in their diaries, they recorded their confusion and their bewilderment at the rapid pace of change, with a little concept of the toll that the war would take and just how much would be changed by the time peace was restored 4 years later. And in the past year, when I've been teaching this material and looking over it, I am sort of struck by a sense of almost deja vu, a sense of, similarity between what these people went through then and sort of a sense of change, sense of living in a historic moment, not knowing how things might work out, things changing rapidly all around them. And in a way, I could see it in our own lives, especially last spring, when things, just turned topsy-turvy very quickly. An estimated 206,000 Irish men voluntarily served in the British Army during the war, and in the parallel service, thousands of Irish women became involved in activities to support the war effort. They hoped that their war service might bring about some reconciliation between divided communities, seeking fulfillment from the restricted domestic spheres, or simply hoping to find some means of alleviating the inevitable suffering that would arise from war. And these are two propaganda posters from the time that would have been present in Ireland. And they see the way that you can see how women were being used in posters at the time and used in propaganda. So in this one for the glory of Ireland, will you go or must I? A woman is effectively attempting to shame a man into going to war. Well, in the other, a woman has been used to symbolize Ireland. And I guess what I'm trying to do is sort of move beyond women as passive symbols, as sort of figures that would entreat men to do their bit, but to also think about what did women themselves do. So this mobilisation took many forms, including nursing wounded soldiers, preparing hospital supplies and parcels of comforts, undertaking auxiliary military roles in port areas or behind the lines, producing weapons of war. And in total, the war effort in Ireland drew in significantly more women than the suffrage campaign or indeed the Republican movement. And it created new roles and opportunities for the thousands of women who were already active in sizable female unionist organisations. For most of the years 1914 to 1918, many more women in Ireland were actively engaged in activities supporting the British war effort than they were in participating in resisting the state and participating in insurrection. Irish women from all classes, religions, and political backgrounds participated in these voluntary activities to support the war effort. Across the island of Ireland, over 13,000 Irish women enrolled with the Joint Committee of the British Red Cross and St. John Ambulance Association, with hundreds of these women serving overseas close to the front. Although Red Cross activity was more common in urban areas, there were branches in every region of Ireland. The women involved came from a mix of backgrounds. The majority were Protestants, but significant numbers of Catholics were involved too. Many held paid employment or worked on the family farm, volunteering in their spare time. And many of them were involved in the organisation in a part-time capacity, so given a few hours a week service in a hospital supply depot or a Red Cross work party. And so these opportunities for part-time service enabled women with home or work duties to support the war effort on their own terms. Voluntary work is more accessible to upper-class women, but social class is most important in dictating the type of voluntary work performed by women. Hundreds of women also served with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and over 100 Irish women served with the Royal Naval Service. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was established in July 1917 by the War Office with the aim of providing support services for the British Army to release more men for military service. It arose out of two voluntary organisations, the Women's Voluntary Reserve and the Women's Legion, both founded by a woman with strong Ulster connections, Edith, the 7th Marchioness of Londonderry. Aware of the potential criticism of these military auxiliary organisations, Lady Londonderry emphasised that the objects of the reserve were diametrically opposed to ostentatious displays of women stamping up and down the country, bristling with firearms and making themselves ridiculous, which of course was the fear at the time. In an account of the organisation's establishment, written in 1944, Londonderry recalled many people were deeply prejudiced at the prospect of women performing war work outside traditional female spheres of nursing, sewing, or cooking. In summer 1915, Lady Londonderry established a Women's Legion, which supplied cooks and drivers and other women workers to the British Army. There are active Legion detachments in Belfast, Cork, and Dublin. And the Londonderry papers, which contain huge amounts of material about the Women's Legion and Lady Londonderry's views on it, are all held in PRONI, which of course is the virtual location of this talk. When the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was established in 1917, hundreds of Irish women joined, and they served in Ireland, Britain, and France as clerks, waitresses, cooks, and drivers. Most of these women were Catholic, and most of them were working class. They were likely motivated by a combination of patriotic and economic factors. Some of them, such as Sophie Pearce-Evans, were evidently seeking excitement and adventure. Sophie Pearce-Evans served as an ambulance driver and a motor dispatch rider with WAAC from 1917 to 1919. Born in Limerick in 1896, Sophie studied at the Royal College of Science from 1914. In 1916, she married an English soldier, and initially she continued her studies at the Royal College. But in April 1917, she joins the WAAC, and this allows her to earn her own income for the first time, to join her husband in serving her country, and to exchange domestic life for a more adventurous one. According to her biographer, Lindy Naughton, the main attraction was to be embarking on her first adventure, unchaperoned, and free to come and go as she wished, with no aunts or husbands holding her back. At first, she was based in England, where she carried messages for the army. She was later sent to France, where she worked with an ambulance unit. In a letter to the Torch magazine, produced by the Royal College of Science in December 1917, she described her experience in England in glowing terms. I enjoy every second of it. It is no end of a rag. The officers get up dances for us about once a fortnight. The work here is pretty stiff, I admit, but there isn't one of us that will go back to civvy life without regret. And while she was in France, she had a portrait painted by the Irish war artist, Sir John Lavery, which is what you can see here. What a beautiful picture. The search for personal fulfillment and a desire for adventure and excitement motivated Sophie's war service. And this was a common motivator for war work. A significant number of the women who devoted their time to the war effort also had a family member serving in the armed forces, and so it likely provided some consolation to be able to contribute in some way themselves. Isa Mahoney, for example, from Dublin, joins the Red Cross. Her brother Edmund enlisted in the British Army, serving with the Munster Fusiliers. Isa serves in France and in Malta as a nurse. She experienced a sense of pride and satisfaction from her work, but also from the small payment that she received for her work, describing it as the first money she ever earned. Although homesick, she was committed to her service, and she signed up for further work in France after her initial stint in Malta, feeling that it was her duty to do so. Emma Duffin, pictured here, was a young middle-class Belfast woman, and she volunteered as a Red Cross nurse, along with her 4 sisters. Their brother, Terence, was an officer in the British Army. In a letter to her mother in May 1915, Emma outlined her motives for volunteering. I'm glad, for I think it is the right thing to do. You'll feel that you are being of some use, and it makes me independent till the end of the war anyway. And I dare say I'll get to like the work. Everyone seems to. It will certainly be interesting. And once again, the Duffin family correspondence and Emma's diaries are all held in PRONI, and I'm very grateful to Trevor Parkhill, who produced edited collections of Emma's diaries from the First World War, but also the Second World War. The sense of it being the right thing to do was very common, with many women feeling almost compelled to do something related to the war. Isabella Cleland from County Antrim inserted a note with her completed British Red Cross service record, outlining how she'd seen a call in the local newspaper for volunteers to help with the sphagnum moss dressings. She described that she was well pleased with the privilege of doing a little bit. Isabella made an estimated 3 dozen bandages each week for 18 months. The war's impact, of course, was felt far beyond mobilisation, affecting women's household management, their family relations, their standard of living, work conditions and opportunities. Women replaced absent men in the workforce, although to a much less significant extent in Britain, where, of course, conscription was implemented. Irish women did take up new jobs in wartime, and they entered previously male-dominated professions in much greater numbers, including the railway industry, the civil service, and the medical profession. They also played a very important role working in munitions factories in Ireland and in Britain. Munitions was very well paid compared to domestic service and other traditional female employments. 5 national shell factories were established in Ireland, in Dublin, Galway, Waterford, and Cork, employing over 2,000 people, almost over 2/3 of whom were women. And the photograph here on the left is from one of the Dublin factories at Parkgate Street. Private firms also gained munitions contracts from the War Office, including Keenox in Arklow, County Wicklow, and Pierce's in Wexford. It was estimated in September 1915 that there were nearly 100 factories of varying sizes engaged in manufacturing war munitions in Belfast alone, while in September 1918, it was reported that close to 5,000 women were working in munitions in Belfast. One such factory was a textile machinery plant, James Mackey and Sons, known as Mackey's. Over the course of the war, the workforce of the factory more than doubled from the pre-war numbers of about 650. The foundry opened a munitions department in early September 1915, producing bombs and grenades. Later in the war, they opened up a shell factory and an aircraft department. Most of the additional wartime staff were women, and the first entry into the factory was described in a later institutional history as an invasion of women. According to this history, the misogynist reportedly bowed to the inevitable, and it was soon acknowledged that the hand that rocks the cradle could gauge a shell to a nigh infinitesimal fraction. Many women were also coping with separation from their husband and attempting to manage a household alone in a time of rising inflation and food shortages. The cost of living doubled in Ireland over the course of the war, with its impact most felt in urban areas. The Catholic Bulletin noticed the changes to the wartime diet in October 1918. No breakfast bacon, margarine instead of butter, and sugar now doled out with a miserly hand. The deficiencies in diet were most felt by women due to the practice of men being fed first, and the need to ensure that the usually male primary wage earner would have sufficient strength for work. These 2 cartoons, which are both taken from the magazine Irish Life, illustrate the wartime conversations about food shortages. In the first, a woman is attempting to buy sugar after the introduction of sugar rationing in 1918. She forgot her ration card the first day, and when she returns the following day with it, she's told that there's no sugar. In the second, the doctor prescribes tablets to be taken with meals, and the patient asks where is he to get the meals from. And so the fact that these are, in this magazine, which is aimed at the middle to upper classes, just shows these are the sort of conversations that people are having. This is the sort of material that they're taking their jokes from, that this is sort of, part of the everyday experience. Food shortages meant that careful household management became increasingly important in wartime. Campaigns regarding conservation of the food supply were aimed at women as guardians of the home. Propaganda posters such as these exhorted them to be careful not to waste food, claiming that through their power as household managers, they could shorten the war by avoiding waste and saving money. Wartime privation was not only considered an economic necessity, but also a sign of patriotism and morality. In Ireland, as elsewhere in Europe, pre-war consumption patterns and indulgences were frowned upon, even when affordable, and they were associated with the hated figure of the war profiteer. And there's a story in the memoir by one of Lady Gregory's grandnieces or nieces, and they talk about when they're a child during the war, George Bernard Shaw is visiting the house, and they're only supposed to have jam on one side of bread, to either butter or jam in order to, not waste food. And he puts jam on one side and butter on the other side as a way of getting around these rules, and the children are absolutely scandalized by this attempt to subvert acceptable consumption patterns. The calls for austerity highlighted class divisions. The Catholic Bulletin noted that the wealthy could still indulge in many luxuries, while the poor could barely afford the bare necessities of life. Claiming that there is never more need for self-denial than the present, they argue that while self-denial was a sad necessity of the poor, it ought to be the proud duty of the leisured rich. A woman was thrown out for a recruitment meeting in Mayo when she interrupted a speaker to protest about the wartime inflation and the cost of a bag of flour in 1915. Around the same time, Rosamond Stephen, an upper-class woman living in Belfast, complained about the increased cost of hats and how the war had made it impossible to acquire good straw hats from Italy. In another Irish Life cartoon titled Wartime Economy, this time from 1916, a wife persuades her husband to give up his luxuries in wartime, and then tells him he can spend his savings on a new set of furs for her. Pierre Machination, the Undersecretary for Ireland from 1914 to 1916, asserted in December 1915 that there was much money in the country at the present time, and apart from the poor people, the community was well off. This rather tautological statement does not, however, make it clear just whom he was including in the category of poor people. For the upper classes, the war meant holidaying in Irish resorts rather than travelling overseas, while for others it meant destitution. Separation allowances did provide some financial compensation for the families of serving soldiers and sailors. In the United Kingdom and its dominions, the wives and children of all the enlisted men received allowances, while other relatives could claim based on pre-war dependency. The majority of the Irish men who served in the wartime British Army would have had some dependents in Ireland in receipt of the allowances. For many women, this pay represented their first regular income, and it's been suggested that they contributed to wartime improvements in health and standard of living. Although the allowances were paid in recognition of their husband's war service, the women did collect the weekly money from the post office themselves, and thus they had control over the spending. For the families of men who were unemployed or working as casual labourers before the war, the money represented a real improvement in income. They no longer had to feed the man in the house who wasn't there, he was at war, and this was guaranteed income. They weren't reliant on him handing over a portion of his pay package to his wife every week, and instead was coming directly to her. Paul Smith's fictionalized memoir of his mother, Mrs. Baines, describes the economic benefit of separation allowance for working class families. Debts were paid and the arrears and the rent, as well as the insurance, so now the constant threat for pauper's burial, if anything happened to herself or one of the children, was no longer a dread. For the first time since she'd married him, she knew what it was to have a week's wages from him. Her husband, in unskilled labour, was a poor provider for his family before the war, spending much of his money on drink, and so the family did better under the separation allowance scheme. The war also brought greater state intervention into women's lives, accompanied by social scrutiny and policing of women's behaviour. Anxiety about inherent increases in drunkenness among the wives of soldiers, and concerns about child neglect led to attempts to surveil and supervise the behaviour of women in receipt of separation allowances. There are also attempts to police the interactions between unmarried women and soldiers, prompted by concern about the spread of venereal disease and a supposed increase in the numbers of babies born out of wedlock. Although many of these things turned out to be hysteria and moral panic, and the numbers of babies born illegitimately did not substantially change during the war. But nonetheless, private behaviour became a matter of public concern, and the war was used to legitimise the state intervening in private lives. War also had a politicising impact, most evident in the participation of women in the Easter 1916 rebellion, an insurrection, of course, designed to take advantage of the wartime conditions, but also the 1918 anti-conscription campaigns. And these, of course, were key events in Ireland's wartime experience. The politicising effects were apparent in the aftermath of the Easter Rising, when women played an essential role in fundraising and propaganda for the Republican movement, but also in the actions of separation women, soldiers' wives, during the by-elections in 1917 and 1918, when they mobilised in support of the Irish Parliamentary Party. Indeed, this complex political background makes the Irish case particularly interesting for exploring the mobilisation process and the diverse factors affecting women's war service. The need for remobilisation in the second half of the war takes place not only in the context of the war weariness, which can be seen all across Europe at that time, but also in the aftermath of armed insurrection in Ireland's capital city. And in my book, I highlight how societies become pulled into the vortex of war, despite domestic political crisis, and even without conscription, particularly high recruitment rates or the experience of bombardment. War can nevertheless have a transformative impact upon society and gender identities. The war ended with the signing of the Armistice on 11th November 1918. In her memoir, The Wandering Years, published in 1922, Catherine Tynan, who is an Irish author, described the moment of the announcement of the Armistice and its reaction in Ireland. So the winter opened with festivities and dances, but before that, there was the Armistice, the amazing, the incredible thing, so long prayed for and hoped for, that when the promise of it came, no one believed it. In an earlier memoir completed in April 1918, Tynan had predicted that there would be no rejoicing when peace finally came. We'd suffered too much for that. We might emerge from under the scourge, but our backs would still be bloody. The reality was a mix of both joy and relief, and a sense of loss and deflation at all those who did not survive to the end. And of course, at the time of the Armistice, Ireland was in the midst of the 1918 flu pandemic, and this inevitably had an impact on the festivities that were possible, but also on the sense of joy and celebration that people could feel at this time. The era of mass death and loss of young people was not yet over. For those bereaved in particular, the ending of the war meant little. Rosamond Stephen described a visit to her neighbour, Mrs. Rice, in Belfast, to tell her the news of the Armistice. She sat by the fire saying, "I'm glad, I'm very glad." And really, she did not care two straws, because her Oni was killed in action, and Joe was in a lunatic asylum with shell shock. She was very fond of those two boys. Bereaved families felt their loss even more keenly when the war ended, and other people's husbands and sons began coming home. Veronica Wynn from County Wicklow wrote her mother in November 1918, "While the announcement of the Armistice was frightfully thrilling, one cannot help wanting her own boy properly." She was referring to her brother Charlie, who had died of wounds while serving in France in June 1917. Approximately 35,000 Irish men who had enlisted from Ireland were killed in the war, leaving many thousands of devastated families behind. Some women could not cope with their wartime losses. Private Thomas Joyce was killed by a shell at the front in late 1915, and on 2nd of January 1916, his widow, Mary Ellen Joyce, drowned herself in a pond in County Leitrim. She left a note for her mother saying she'd gone to Tommy. We promised each other we would follow one another. This was not an isolated case. Rosamond Stephen described 2 suicides in her Belfast neighbourhood involving the mothers of soldiers, which are attributed to women's anxiety over their sons in the trenches. Although women's war service, of course, carried much less risk than that of men in the armed forces, at least 43 women from Ireland died in active service between 1914 and 1918, while 113 women died in 1919 of causes related to the war. Alongside professional and voluntary nurses, these included members of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the Women's Legion, the Women's Royal Air Force, and the Women's Royal Naval Service. Indeed, the dubious honour of being the only member of the Women's Royal Naval Service to die in the Great War due to enemy action goes to an Irish woman. Josephine Carr drowned in the sinking of the Leinster mailboat on 10th of October 1918. Born in Cork in 1899, she'd recently enlisted with the Wrens to work as a shorthand typist. She was travelling on the Leinster en route to England for Wren's work and was with 2 colleagues from Cork, Maureen Waters and Lillian Barry, who both survived the sinking. Maureen Waters recalled afterwards a moment of the torpedo collision. The ship was standing upright almost, propeller in the air. I prayed as I never did before. Carr's body, like so many of the casualties, was never recovered. She is, however, commemorated on the Rounds Memorial in Plymouth. She is one of 10 Irish women on active service who died in the sinking of the Leinster mailboat. Among the 9 others was Claire McNally, a member of the Women's Legion, whose father had been killed earlier in the war while serving with the Connaught Rangers. Many of the women who died in active service are buried far from home, in England, France, Italy, Malta, Egypt, Palestine, and Salonika. 18 of the nursing casualties are commemorated in St. Anne's Cathedral in Belfast, pictured here, while others are remembered in parish memorials. These include Isa Mahoney. She died in April 1919 in Dublin. She's believed to have contracted tuberculosis while serving with the Red Cross in France. Her brother Edmund was killed in the war, and their father organised for both of them to be listed on the same memorial in St. Mary's Church on Haddington Road in Dublin. Veronica Wynn was initially concerned by what the ending of the war meant for her wartime employment in a censor's office in London. Her letters to her mother display the uncertainty created by the Armistice. Mrs. Phil seems to think we might get a week's notice anytime soon. I don't think anyone really knows. She ever quickly became enthused about the prospect of coming home, finding that the work held less fulfillment for her once the war had ended. The work is stale and stifling. I'm longing to paint and to write, and still more to be home. It is long enough to be away while the war was on. The sense of uncertainty and instability described by Veronica Wynn was common enough to many women war workers, for whom the armistice had an immediate economic impact. Although Veronica came from an upper-class family and had independent means, many working-class women faced unemployment and hardship in Ireland and Great Britain at the end of the war. Those who were working on munitions contracts or employed for the War Office quickly found themselves without work and with little prospect of new employment except in domestic service. Many workers in munitions factories in Dublin were laid off within a few weeks of the announcement of the armistice on 11th November 1918. Literally by the end of November, many of the factories are closed down and laid off their workers. Unemployment was very high in post-war Ireland, and men were given priority for what work was available. Women were encouraged to retrain for domestic service and to take up women-specific occupations. And many of them had no choice to do so, while others chose to emigrate to seek work, re-establishing the pre-war pattern of exceptionally high emigration from Ireland. Many of those who were active in the war effort returned to the domestic sphere and resumed their pre-war lives. Some remained active in philanthropic work. Emma Duffin, for example, became a member of the Belfast Council of Social Welfare Committee after the war, and during the Second World War, she served as commandant of the VAD unit at the Stranmillis Military Hospital in Belfast. And she keeps a diary during the Belfast Blitz, and it's quite interesting in terms of how she compares her experience in the First World War to the Second, and how she relates to the young nurses Second World War and compares them to what she believes she was like in the First World War. You can see her, speaking from a position of experience at that stage. Sophie Pearce-Evans became a keen athlete, and she was one of the founders of the Women's Amateur Athletic Association. In 1926, she qualified as a private pilot, and she became the first woman in Ireland or Great Britain to obtain a commercial flying license. And she's better known by her, so she married several times. She's better known by one of her married names as Lady Mary Heat. Her biographer, Lindy Naughton, suggests that she craves the adventure and the danger offered by the war, and she spends the rest of her rather short, in some ways sad life, attempting to relive those lost days of excitement and independence. Reflecting on her war experience 2 decades later, the nurse Catherine Black, who's from County Donegal, was very aware of its significance in her life. She wondered how she endured the wartime years of nursing service in France, finding it only possible to reflect upon them at all from the distance of 20 years. She writes in her memoir, that you cannot go through the things we went through, see the things we saw, and remain the same. You went into it young and light-hearted. You came out older than any span of years could make you. And I remember it's really quite interesting in terms of its very vivid descriptions of the casualty clearing stations close to the front, of the lines of soldiers on stretchers on the ground, and of her own experience of bombardment behind the front lines. The Countess of Ingle, who was also very active in the war effort, described in her memoir the difficulty of adjusting to the post-war life and coping with the social circles with the losses that her social circle had sustained. She wrote, "The world we'd known had vanished. We hunted again, but ghosts rode with us. We sat at table, but there were absent faces." And indeed, the aristocracy in Ireland, the landed gentry, suffered particularly badly from the war. They had disproportionate rates of enlistment, and because they're quite a close-knit community, a loss felt by one family was felt by them all, and many families lost several children and suffered very serious financial consequences as well, with the loss of several estates in the decades immediately afterwards. Okay, I want to briefly talk now about my book, which you can see here, and my approach to all of this research. So how I came to sort of some of the stuff that I've been talking to you there. So I first became interested in this topic in 2010 when I was completing my undergraduate degree. And I quickly realized that there had been very little published on the experience of Irish women in the war, despite the fact that gender had been established in the 1970s as an important category of analysis in the international scholarship of First World War studies. And so I could see that it was there in the international literature, but there seemed to be a bit of a gap for Ireland. And the late historian Keith Jeffrey described the topic rather eloquently in his 2000 book, Ireland and the Great War, as a historically hidden Ireland. In a chapter in 2008 in the collection Our War, Trina Clear described women's war story as hidden in the shadows. And over the past decade, women have emerged from the historical shadow. And this book is part of that process of reclaiming that history and uncovering these stories. My aim was to offer a new lens for exploring the history of the First World War and the Irish Revolution, moving away from traditional political or military histories to focus on the lived experience of those who were attempting to go about their lives during a period of national and international turmoil. The book challenges existing narratives about the extent of the war's impact on Ireland and provides a new conceptual framework for understanding women's lives during this period, in this decade of change. I had to grapple with some of the key issues in international scholarship concerning the extent of the war's lasting impact on women, whether it constitutes progress or a parenthesis in the struggle for women's liberation. Does it act as a watershed for women's rights in the 20th century? Is it this defining moment at which things begin to change for women? Drawn on the work of British historians such as the late Gail Braybon and Angela Woolacott, I concluded that the focus on emancipation can risk distorting our understanding of how women experienced the war by viewing gender relations solely through the prism of lasting social change. One of the most important things to bear in mind, so for me when I was doing this study, was the need to avoid generalizations that might suggest a homogenous identity and an experience for all Irish women. Taking an all-island approach to the First World War period, the book attempts to untangle the different meanings of the war for Irish people and to represent these diverse perspectives. There are great differences between urban and rural experiences and between North and South, sufficient that we can talk of plural home fronts, borrowing a phrase from the historian Karen Hunt. In Ireland, farming families prospered from the increased demand for their produce, while price inflation and food shortages created the grim conditions for urban dwellers that I've mentioned. Those living in the towns and cities suffered from the war's impact the most, but they're also most likely to benefit from the expanded opportunities that it generated. Munitions factories, home front positions in clerical work, army auxiliary service, and hospital nursing, these were primarily, although not exclusively, clustered in the towns. The majority Protestant population in Ulster also carved out their own experience. War service became an opportunity to prove their loyalty to Britain and to the Empire, but also to create further distance from the South. The emancipatory potential of wartime work or voluntary mobilisation were also affected by social class, the pre-war circumstance of the family, and women's domestic responsibilities. We must consider how women themselves viewed their wartime experiences and how they conceptualized and understood what was happening to them. And so in this book, I've attempted to get to grips with the issue identified by historian Jay Winter in his pioneering work, The Great War and the British People. The war can bring quantitative structural benefits to people's standard of living or employment prospects, but can nevertheless be experienced by them as monumental disaster for the people who were living through it. Returning the focus to lived experience can help us see the gritty realities of war and help us gain a stronger understanding of what the war meant for women in Ireland and how this might compare to other combatant countries. So to do this, I pieced together this examination of women's lives using a diverse range of primary sources, drawn from 22 archives and libraries in Ireland and the United Kingdom. I made use of 40 contemporary newspapers and periodicals from Ireland and Britain to assist with this history from below approach. I made particularly extensive use of the Lady of the House magazine and the Irish Citizen, which is Ireland's suffrage newspaper. I also used sampling methods to examine the experience of war workers, drawn on the membership records of Irish women who served with the British Red Cross and the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And this made it possible to uncover the participation and experience of a much wider range of women and to interrogate assumptions regarding the class and the religious profile of war workers. And the image here is of a Red Cross service record, which thankfully has been digitized by the British Red Cross archives in London. Initially, when I started this research, one had to go to London and go through them all manually, and they were sorted alphabetically, but not by place or location. But now one can search for Ireland, for specific places in Ireland, to find records relating to this country. Uncovering the individual experience is important, and the book draws upon diaries, personal correspondence, and memoirs. And this is what I've used to tell some of the stories that I've discussed here. However, older adult literacy levels were exceptionally high and roughly equal among men and women in Ireland by 1914. There are relatively few surviving personal accounts of domestic and social life on the Irish home front. And this is influenced by the lack of academic and popular interest in Irish participation in the Great War until the 1980s, which meant that items of historic value relating to the war were less likely to be valued or donated to public bodies. Women's voices, however, are underrepresented in the archives beyond Ireland. This is not just an issue in Ireland. The historians Alison Fell and Lucy Noakes about observed the prioritization of the male combatant experience, resulting in the memorialization of fewer first-hand accounts of grief or coping with family, work, and shortages of food and fuel in wartime. And you often find letters of between a soldier and his wife back home. But of course, the family keep the soldiers' letters, and these get donated to a library or to an archive because the family believes that historians might be interested in the soldiers' accounts of, what it's like to be a soldier at the time. But either soldier doesn't manage to keep the letters that his wife writes him, or they never get donated because they're not considered worthy of historical attention. And of course, those letters that I'm most interested in. Nevertheless, despite these gaps in the archives, I've been able to piece together the stories of many Irish women whose lives were affected by the war. These include Isabella Clarke, who left her home in Belfast, aged 16, to work in munitions factories in England. Marie Martin and Isa Mahoney, who served in voluntary nursing roles with the Red Cross in France and in Malta. Letitia Overend, who played an important leadership role with the Wartime St. John Ambulance Association and the Irish War Hospital Supply Depot, who writes in her diary at the end of the war that she's not quite sure how she feels having the chains of war suddenly loosened, that she's feeling sad at the loss of the busy activity that had sustained her throughout the 4 years. I've also attempted to find the voices of those who remained at home, the mothers, wives, and sisters of soldiers. So people like Emily Shirley, who busied herself with charitable work in Monaghan while waiting for her son to return home, but who herself passes away from illness in 1918. Denton MacDonald, who kept the family farm going in her husband's absence, and wrote to tell him about a new puppy and how proud he would be of their children, only for the letter to be returned with her husband's possessions when he died a few months before the war ended. Phyllis Kelly, who writes to her boyfriend, who's serving with the British Army, and sustains him. He's only in his late teens, and she keeps his courage up and manages to support him through this, and eventually gets news that he's passed away in 1916. She never gets married and keeps a photograph of him above her bed for the rest of her life. Or Mary Martin, who kept a diary for 6 months in 1916, said that her son Charlie, who'd been reported missing in Gallipoli, might be brought up to date on all that he had missed. And the diary ends abruptly when she finally gets confirmation that he indeed had passed away. Immersing myself in the diaries, letters, memoirs of women such as these was a moving experience, and I hope I've succeeded in giving the readers and you yourselves tonight some insight into these women's stories, and that the book sheds light on aspects of our history that have often been ignored or forgotten. In July 1918, the Church of Ireland Gazette reflected in an article titled "The Modern Girl" on the women's emancipation movement, arguing that its fruits had ripened. The characteristic of the modern girl is the assertion of her independence, politically, economically, and spiritually, and her note is a note of interrogation. Women in Ireland, as in other combatant countries, have participated in the war effort, with their roles ranging from manager of the family budget, to nursing wounded soldiers, to producing weapons of war. Many gained new confidence and took advantage of the wartime opportunities to enter different areas of employment, even if just for the duration of war. However, for many, the war was a time of hardship and suffering, with bereavement and loss among the common experiences on the home front. In my book, I attempt to tell the stories of these women, and by doing so, to offer a new perspective on the history of Ireland in the 20th century. Thank you very much for listening.